I'm Walter Treur. I'm a software engineer and a Scrum Master at Luminis, Luminis ARNHEM. Not necessarily in that order, by the way. I usually work in projects where customer or company would like to try something new, forms a small team, and when I do software development, it's usually on the front end, Angular, Angular 2. Some people would still know me from back in the day when I did Adobe Flex, which is still around, I think. But next to that, I'm also heavily involved, or try to be involved in the process, or mostly the Scrum Master role. So this talk today is going to be about my experience in that role, and particularly about the user story map. So the topics we're going to cover. Oh, I can see it over there. That's nice. Before we dive into it, we're going to look at the product backlog, how that's being applied in projects today. With that, we're going to look at the user story map, just a little dive into our tiptoe, so to say, with the user story map 101. We're going to talk about release planning, how you're going to use your story map to address the issues you're going to have when you're doing release planning. How that fits into the product backlog, the story map. I want to talk about legacy projects. I was confused about the term, but it's basically projects that you're already working on today. So your non-greenfield projects, so to say. If we have time, I want to talk about how you can apply story maps in larger projects where you are working with multiple teams on a single product. And then, by the end, some recap. So what's on your product backlog? It usually starts with user stories, right? And I was working for this company, and they were relatively new to Scrum, and they were using user stories with this template or this narrative. And what you would usually see in the beginning is that they would have a hard time identifying the type of users they have. So they would start off with, as a authorized user, I want to some goal, so that's some reason. And I was looking over the product backlog, and I was saying, as an authorized user this, as an authorized user that, as an authorized user. And I was asking these guys, and I say, okay, so when you go to a party, right? You go to some birthday party, you invited your neighbor's going to talk to you, and you're going to talk about your work. And your neighbor asks you, okay, so for who are you making the software you're working? So the answer would be, as authorized users, right? So the authorized users are going to use your software. But when properly applied, a user story gives you key benefit, or key insight, hopefully, in the type of users that you are making your software for. But there are some difficulties with that, and it starts with coffee. People who know me know that I've spent the last 11 months in Tallahassee, Florida. I lived and worked there for some time. And one of the things that you saw in the movie, by the way, as well, is that they have horrible coffee at the office. I mean, they had like the small canisters, but they also have like the big cans that only get cleansed out like once every 10 years or something. So it was horrible, and you can imagine that when you live and work there and you are accustomed to the Dutch coffee, you go to Starbucks, or at least some other coffee joint that you can get your coffee. And I was standing there with my orange backpack, tall, towering above the Americans, waiting in line. I think it was a Friday morning, 8 o'clock, and at some point a colleague walked into the coffee bar. He greeted me, of course, because I was pretty noticeable with my tall appearance. He went to the end of the counter, he grabbed his coffee, and he walked out of the coffee joint. And I was confronting him with that at the office, and he said, well, you can just order ahead with your Starbucks app, so you can get your coffee before you leave on your way to work, and so you can skip the line. So at that point, I was thinking, I'm going to use that mobile application. So What if we were to develop that, right? It's a perfect case if you want to develop your mobile application to order coffee ahead of time. And it would start with something like, as a weird foreigner, I want to order coffee ahead of time so I look less like a fool waiting in line. I had tea here, yeah. But this is obviously a bit too big, right, for a team to start with. I mean, this could easily take months if you want to. So what would we do? We make them smaller. We make user stories smaller. It could be something like this. As a weird foreigner, I want to select a drink so I can order my coffee, right? One step you want to take in your application. And the other one would be about choosing your pickup store so you can get to the right store on your way to work. And at last, you want to pay in advance because otherwise you still cannot skip the line. So what would happen if we put that into your typical Scrum process? You would put it on your backlog, right? Put it on your backlog. You grab one or two stories depending on the capacity of your team, put it on your sprint backlog, start working on it, and at the end you have your, as I spotted already, potentially shippable product. What is potentially shippable? Is it we can sell it? Is it tested? Is it code reviewed? Is it whatnot? I mean, that's one of the difficult things with Scrum is that how do you determine what is potentially shippable? But it usually has something to do with your definition of done, right? As opposed to waterfall, we said, well, we're going to make smaller pieces of our software one at a time, and we make sure that we are complying with our quality criteria, our testing criteria, our build process criteria. But it's not always something that your user wants at the end of your sprint. For example, if I were to develop the application and I would start with selecting your coffee first, but I don't do anything with selling or checkout, with pay with credit card or Ideal, the user doesn't want to use that yet. It's not usable. So there's a key difference between your potentially shippable product and something that your user wants. And it usually has something to do with technical readiness of your product. Is it in your built environment? Is it deployed? Is it tested? Code quality? And on the other hand, is it useful for your end user? And this is where your product backlog not always helps, as we've seen with the user story. FYI, if you have any questions, concerns, just raise your hand. I can address them right away. If we have some time after the presentation, we can talk about it as well. So don't feel taken aback when you want to ask a question. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Does the user story has to be so long as like the template, like as a user, it's kind of a repetitive thing?
Right. So the question is, does the user story always have to comply to that particular template, right? No, it doesn't. But this is one of the templates that you can use to spark a conversation about user stories or about feature or user criteria that you want to have. Because it says something about who your user is. It says something about what your application is doing or what kind of feature it's providing. But it also says something about the end goal. Why do you want to have this particular feature? That's something that people mostly leave out at the end. It's just, as a user, I want to blah, 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 period. Instead of, but why? Why does a user want to do something? So that template is particularly useful if you want to cover that. But it's not mandatory. So bring in the user story map. And before we do that, I want you to just forget a bit about the product backlog I just told you and look at these steps we're going to take. You choose your drink when you're opening your app. You choose your shop or where you want to pick up your drink at the end. You want to do some checkout. I mean, I have to pay with my credit card or Ideal or Bitcoin if you want to be fancy. And at the end, I want to see whether my drink is ready or not so I can, go to the store to pick it up. But how do you choose a drink? Is it just a simple drop-down list? Is it a very interesting graph of all the different options you have at Starbucks because they have like a gazillion? How do you pay? Is it Ideal? Is it credit card? Or is it just, when you're at the cashier? How do you see your order status? So there's all different ways about how you can implement this. So let's dive a bit deeper in that. Let's pick the most simplest options that we can think of right now. Just limit the 5 most popular drinks when you select your drink. I mean, as I said before, Starbucks has a very variety of drinks. When you choose your shop, you can just say, just do it from a simple list. Ideal payment, because that's what we do in the Netherlands. Credit card is not that big. And your order status can be just, a list that you have to refresh manually. And we can go deeper than that, or more bit advanced, so to say. So instead of the 5 most popular drinks, I'm going to say, do the 5 most popular syrups as well. And instead of selecting it from a list, select it on a map, with your indicators so you can see where your nearest Starbucks is at. Credit card payment, and of course, I don't want to hit the refresh button continuously, so I'm going to implement something about a background refresh. My clicker is not working. We can continue on with that. Credit card, PayPal, push notification, because I'm not going to look at that list when I order it ahead. And I think you get the gist at the end. You're going to get more elaborate features like selecting from a previous order, or based on your sleeping pattern, Starbucks is going to suggest you this particular coffee, or when you have kids. Who knows? But it's still always in the context of a particular user task. You choose your drink, you choose your shop, you check out, and you see your order status. So those are your user tasks, so to say. In this case, it's chronological order, but it's in a logical order from left to right. And then your user subtasks are going to be below that, and they're going to say something about the richness of your feature. So you have your steps, and you have your richness from top to bottom. Make sense so far? So how does that, I think it's the range, fit into your release planning? Or how does a user story map help with release planning? What kind of issues do we have with release planning? Usually one would pick up a model like what we would call the iron triangle of project management, right? We have 3 things that are related to each other. Your scope, how many features am I going to build? Your time, how much time is it going to cost me if I want to implement this whole set of features? And how much money is it going to cost me? Or how many people do I need to implement? Oh, I'm sorry. But they're all related to each other, because if I change the amount of features that I'm going to implement, whether or not it's stories or story points or just a set of things that I need to do, I'm going to impact my time, right? They're related to each other. And if I need more time, it's going to cost me more money, or if I'm going to bring more people onto the project, well, depending on when you do that, it's going to take you less time. For example, when your team just starts. But at the end, when you have a late project and you bring more people into the mix, your project is going to be later, probably, because these people need to be brought up to speed. It's going to take time of the others. So, you heard the saying, bringing more people to a late project usually makes it later. So they are related to each other, but it's a bit tricky. So at one point we decided, you know what? Let's have a fixed scope. I need all these features. And then your project manager, your product manager walks into the room and is going to say, when is it going to be finished? Right? Or how much money do you need? How much people do I need? Your typical waterfall project, right? We have the big functional description of what your project needs to do. And then you're going to say, well, I need 5 teams, I need 3 months, I need 5 years. That is what you're going to use to change. And then waterfall was not very popular anymore, and Agile came around. And with Agile, we basically turned it around. We said, we're going to have a fixed team of 5 people. We're going to release every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. So the only thing that we can change or is flexible is the scope. The amount of features you can implement every sprint. Or if you want to calculate it, the amount of story points. But as we will see, most of the time, it's not always black and white like that. Let me give you an example using the story map again. We deduced that we need at least some support for these 4 steps. Let's call it the backbone of our application, right? We need to have some option to choose your drink, some option to pay. So if we just say, limit it to only the most simplest implementation I can think of, we have our walking skeleton. We have some support for choosing a drink, we have some support for choosing your shop, some support for an ideal payment, or in this case, a checkout payment. We decided that the order status, well, it's not that important because usually people just, order ahead and just go into their car, drive to the Starbucks, and hopefully they're right on time. So it's not strictly necessary, so we leave that one out. People would also call it your minimum viable product, right? I see some recognition here. It's basically the same thing. I would like to call it a walking skeleton with a coffee. But it's a fixed scope, right? I can't release without some payment option. I can't release without some way to choose my shop, or at least my user doesn't really see any value. I mean, I can implement it, right? It's potentially shippable without, but it's not something that my user would like to do. So this is your fixed scope. Usually in the beginning of your project or when you start a new big feature, you're going to have something like this, and you're going to have your minimum viable product. And as you see, your story map has the ability to give you insight in what kind of steps or what kind of features you need to implement without going into much detail just yet. It allows you to negotiate, which I'm going to show you next. Because after you've done something like that, you have your release schedule. It's going to be your first release with just the simplest options. Then your second release where you're going to say, well, I want to have something about a better way of selecting the store on a map. So I'm going to implement that. And it's part of the choose shop step or user task. In your same can be done for the other subtasks, as you will see. But it's your flexible scope, right? Because at the end of the sprint, you're going to say, well, I only implemented that select on map thing, but I already have something with ideal payment, so I can release to my user again. But it also allows you to negotiate with your product owner or your stakeholders to say, well, I think credit card payment is more important or less important. So I'm going to use the auto select on a map feature first. I know that the checkout one is not that elaborate anymore, but we already have an ideal payment. So you have something to negotiate about without worrying or without having no knowledge or insight in whether or not your next release is going to be something that your user wants or adds value for your end user. All right then. I have my product backlog and I have my story map. Do I need to use them both or not? How does it fit into all of it, all of the sprint or scrum pattern? And by the way, if you're not using scrum but something like Kanban, you can still have something similar because you still have something what we would call a product backlog. You just do not release in cycles but continuously. Potentially shippable, by the way. So usually we would use the story map as a feed for your product backlog. So you build your story map with your product owner, or your product owner builds one with your scrum master, with some other stakeholders, perhaps an architect. And if you want to be really simple about it, you can just say, you know what? Let's call these steps epics. Let's call the rest stories. What was an epic again? Does anyone know? It's basically just a large user story, right? Something that we think of in terms of something that the user wants to do, but it's too large to implement in one sprint, so we would call it an epic. I mean, it's some fancy agile term. It's just, you know, a category that you want to use in your product backlog, if you will. So let's assume that this is your release schedule, right? So the first one is your MVP or your walking skeleton. Second one is your next release. You have a priority. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if you want to be really simple about it, you're going to just say, put it all on the backlog. But here's something peculiar about that. Let's say, rewind 3 years back when Bitcoin was all the rage. Was it 3 years ago? I can't remember. In any case, I can imagine that at that point in time, releasing an application which has the ability to sell with Bitcoins or pay with Bitcoins was something new, something fancy, something that you want to try out in your new application. So it is also something that your development team might not have a lot of experience with. So you might want to say, I don't want to start with, selecting your next coffee. I want to start with the Bitcoin payment because that's more risky, that's more extensive for us, we don't have a lot of know-how. And this is where your advantage of your user story map comes into play, because you can still start with, well, let's pick the number 3 one up there and put it on the top. You can still start implementing that. But at some point, you're going to say, well, I need some way to order a drink, or I need some way to choose a shop. To choose a shop. So you know that even you start with the most risky thing or the most interesting thing you want to do, it's not always necessarily the thing that your user does first. So this, in relation to your product backlog and your story map, it gets you that info. But it's tightly coupled. Because we have said in this example that all the blue sticky notes are user stories and all the yellow sticky notes are epics. Or the user tasks are going to be epics and the user subtasks are going to be stories. If you're confused about naming, you're probably not paying attention, because I am. And this is where the reality comes into play, because sometimes that little subtask over there is too large for your team to implement at once, or we need to do some technical exploration about some fancy framework that we want to use, or all kind of things. So at that point in time, you're going to recognize that not everything can be related one-on-one between your user story map and your product backlog. It's not that always that straightforward by saying, oh, just put all the blue sticky notes in user stories and the rest are epics or something. The reality is usually a lot harder than that. So at some point, you're going to ask yourself, where do I put it? If you think of something that your team needs to do I put it on my product backlog? Or do I put it on my user story map? And I usually try to use this rule of thumb and saying, is it valuable for your user? Is it something that your end user is going to see? Start putting it on your user story map first, and then move it to your product backlog in perhaps smaller tasks, smaller stories, smaller whatever item you're going to call it. If it's only valuable for your team, for example, some framework exploration, some bootstrapping stuff that we need to do, it doesn't have any value to put it on your user story map. Just put it on your backlog. So there's not always something straightforward about stories and epics in your product backlog, as we've did with the yellow sticky notes. Which we call user tasks. Reality is usually a much more nuanced way, and that's why I'm suggesting to think about who benefits from the information. If you want to feel more comfortable, if you want to add something that adds more value to your user, put it on your story map, and otherwise put it on your backlog. And of course, everything that is in your story map probably will end up in your backlog eventually. Now, I have seen smaller projects where, particularly in the beginning, where people would just say, you know what, let's get rid of that whole product backlog and just use a story map only. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you have a small project with only small user stories, small epics, there's no need to maintain both, because that's more burden on my project. The one thing that you don't want to do is get rid of it once you start working on it. Obviously, this is not set in stone. If you build your user story map and then you're going to move everything to your product backlog, you're going to lose the insight in your user that's taking these particular steps, and you're going to lose the benefit of determining what your next release is going to be. But still, if it is too big of a burden to maintain both, you might decide to get rid of it. But if you're having trouble determining your next release or thinking about whether or not it is more valuable to your user, I would say reinstate it or don't get rid of it in the first place.
Walter,
Sure.
can you explain from experience in real life why people drop the story map in the project? Is it a discipline thing, so to speak?
Yeah, most of the time it's a discipline thing. So when are people deciding to get rid of the user story map? That was the question. I've seen some people didn't quite fully understand the benefit of the user story map and said, just put it on the backlog. It's over there. We use the user story narrative. It's a burden for us enough to write it down with all the template thingies. And some would say, well, once we started, we already know what we need to do, so it's in our minds and heads, so why not get rid of the story map entirely? It's an information radiator. Why do you get rid of your sprint backlog if you know what you want to do? Well, sometimes people forget or you want to have insight in the status. So it's usually a discipline thing or there's no time thing or they think there's no time thing. Yeah, those are the primary things that I've seen. Which brings me to a bit of a bonus sidestep. I'm not going to dive into this too much, but there are obviously tools to help you out with this, right? The story map was originally coined by Jeff Patton, I think. He called it user story mapping. It was basically a way to, well, map your product backlog. So basically do it the other way around, which we're going to see later. But there are tools and there are flavors of tools. Most of the time you have an option about whether or not it's a standalone product or something that heavily integrates with your Scrum tracking system or your project management system. For example, Jira or Issue View. The thing is, when you're using a plugin, there's a tight coupling between your user story map and your product backlog. So in this case, the example of the Jira plugin, every step is going to be an epic, every subtask is going to be a user story. There's nothing you can do about that. You might be able to use some other non-user story product backlog item as a subtask, but that's mainly about it. So if you have a huge backlog with a lot of stories in there, a lot of product backlog items, there might be a bit of an overhead in having a standalone tool when you have to, type everything all over again. So then I would suggest try to look in one of these plugins because that takes away some of that burden. The downside is that you lose the flexibility when you're using a standalone tool and use it as a way to explore your next feature or your next product, because in my opinion, especially in the beginning of the project, sticky notes usually works best. If you just want to explain the story map at first and then use that in a workshop with your stakeholders, your product owner, just put it on a wall, sticky notes. If you don't understand it, tear it down, put it up again. It is a perfect way to communicate your user story mapping. So what about those big, old, legacy projects? Or just your existing project? I mean facetious here. What if we have a product backlog and we want to benefit from the advantages of user story mapping? Where do we start? And this is where I'm going to lose my slides a bit and I'm going to take you to some real-world example. Oh, wow. I'm hoping that I can mirror my display over here. There you go. This way, some way. Where do I go? Oh boy. Arrangement, mirror. There we go. Can you guys see this in the back? Or read it? Yeah? All right. I didn't want to use Jira or some other tool, but this is a long product backlog. When I say long, I say 100 stories. And I got this from the, I think it was Mountain Goat Software that originally created the website for the Scrum Alliance. And this is the user stories they would use to develop their first Scrum Alliance website. We have something with profiles that you can create. We have something about news items, courses and events, frequently asked questions, and whatnot. So it's already ordered in or grouped in such a way which you usually see in a real life product backlog. But if you have trouble defining your next feature, or if you have issues, seeing the oversight of your enormous product backlog with hundreds and hundreds of stories, user story mapping might help you out. And this is what I want to do with you guys with this existing product backlog. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the profile section first, and I'm going to just say that I want to start, in this case, with a new, oh, I don't want to do that. With an OmniGravel tool. Actually, I downloaded it 3 days ago, as you can see. You can do it with Glyphy if you're using Confluence. You can do sticky notes. You can just use Paint if you want to, as long as you have something to draw squares and lines. So let's start with the first square. Rectangle, I'm sorry. Let me see. As a site member, I want to describe myself on my own page in a semi-structured way, and then something. Let's just use the beginning first. As a site member, I want to describe myself on my own page. This is basically about building your profile, right? Just put something out there. This is my name, this is my picture, what have you. So call it build profile. I could use the entire user story narrative here if you want to, but it takes a lot of space, and I feel that I usually lose the oversight. When I just use little keywords like that, it gives me more inside information at first glance instead of reading all these words. But if you want to do it correctly, eventually you might want to use the user story template. It's up to you. I'm using the keywords for now. So next up, as a site member, I can fill out an application to become a practitioner. So apparently I can set up something that I'm a Scrum practitioner. Copy the square. What was it again? Fill out practitioner application. Practitioner. I was rehearsing this and I couldn't spell practitioner right at first, so I'm glad it's happening again. Fill out practitioner. As a practitioner, I want my profile page to include additional details about me. For example, practitioner answers. Copy that again and say fill out practitioner details. Makes sense, right? As a site member, I want to fill out an application to become a trainer. I'm going to copy this one again. I'm going to say fill trainer application. Actually, I think I need to say fill out because that's English correct, right? So fill out application for trainer. As a trainer, I want my profile page to include additional details. Makes sense. Copy that and say fill out trainer details. You with me so far? Let's see, can I do the rest as well? As a practitioner or trainer, oh yeah, that was interesting. As a practitioner or trainer, I want when I provide content to the site, I want a small graphic associated with the content indicating I'm a practitioner or trainer. For example, Amazon's top 500 reviewers approach. Now, I have no idea what the Amazon's top 500 reviewers approach is, but I think it is basically just a badge at your content that you're publishing that you say, I'm a trainer, I'm a practitioner, right? So I'm going to say add trainer/practitioner badge. Practitioner. I'm so glad I'm not using sticky notes. All right, upcoming classes, I'm going to skip that. As a site member, I can view the profile of other members. That's interesting. View profile of others. Mark my profile as private. That's interesting. Set profile privacy. I'm going to do one more. As a site administrator, I can read practicing and training applications and approve or reject them. So apparently when you apply for an application, it has to be approved or rejected by some site admin. Site admin application approval. All right, it's a mess, right? So let's group this. Let's see, we had something about practitioners over here, and this is the practitioner details. This is about a trainer. Let's move this all away. Trainer details, profile. Hey, that's about profile. Put that over there. Trainer practitioner badge. That's basically the same, right? Trainer, practitioner. It's a bit over there. And then profile privacy. I think I'm going to put that under profile as well. And then your site admin application approval, which is a bit on the right. I can put it on the left. But as you can see, if I move it a bit better, we almost have something that we can define as columns, right? We have some basic steps. We have building your profile, do something with applications about trainer or practitioner, and then your site admin is going to approve or perhaps reject your application. So let's identify these steps. Profile management. Practitioner, yeah. No. Practitioner. And then the last one is the admin. Trainer info. Oh. Let's give this a fancy color. Rich grapefruit. I never knew. All right, so we have our steps or our user tasks. And if you want to be a bit more explicit about, we can say, make some user story narrative out of these 4 grapefruit richness colored sticky notes, right? We can say, as a user or as a authorized user, no, I'm sorry, as a Scrum practitioner, I want to set up my basic profile. Or as a Scrum practitioner / trainer, I want to set up my basic profile. I mean, if that will help you, you can do that. It is not strictly necessary. But if you look at it, we have profile management, practitioner info, trainer info, admin, and we can say, this is going to be our backbone. And then the most simplest implementation would be building your profile. The most simplest implementation would be set up a practitioner application. And at first, I might decide I don't want to have something about training or trainer application. I only want to make sure that the practitioner application is being approved. So I have my first version. Or your MVP or your walking skeleton. And we can do the same for the next one. Perhaps I only want to focus on the trainer application and perhaps only viewing profile of others. So that way I can, where's the line? I can have a complete set of trainers and practitioners that can find each other on our website. But we've seen a lot of other sections over here with news, with courses and events, with frequently asked questions. If you want to capture that in the same user story map, we can add an extra dimension if we want to by saying, you know what, let's call this thing over here profile, like in the original product backlog. Let's give it a other color, in this case, something green. And this is one area of your features or perhaps even some user activity. And we can copy this pattern for our other sections if we want to. Let me zoom out. Let's assume this is about news or about the homepage or something else. This is a more larger user story map, or this became a more larger story map. And we added an extra dimension on top of that. Now, one might ask, is this order that I'm using always a chronological order? Most applications are not linear like that, right? I mean, I can change my profile all the while I'm setting up a practitioner info or doing some admin tasks if I'm both. So the logical order is not always the chronological order of your user from left to right. So if you're having trouble deciding that, think about whatever usually comes first, your happy path, so to say. People usually set up a profile, well, I think they always set up a profile first, before they are able to do something with trainer or practitioner info. So it makes sense to put that from left to right, but the admin can do his stuff everywhere in between, but you might want to put it at last because it's something that you're going to usually do at the end when your application is being approved or rejected. So there's no strict rule about whatever comes first and next. Any questions about what we just did? Yes?
With the traditional roles you mostly have in a team like UX or Scrum Master or product owner, which is most likely the person to do this? Is it before the product owner puts it on backlog as input for the product owner? Is it the UXer, the team? Is it the Scrum Master? Who is the most likely person to sit down and do what you...
Right. Who's most likely to set up a story map like that? Who's the most likely person to build a product backlog? Your product owner, right? Is it just the product owner? He usually uses input from stakeholders. Those stakeholders could be business specialists, UXers, Scrum Masters, architects. The story map, if you want to use that in the beginning of the project, it usually makes sense to let at least the process of building it be owned by the product owner. But that doesn't mean that he has to do it all by himself. He can If he needs to, he can ask the expertise of a business owner or a technical person that can add some more details about whether or not this comes first or next. And as with everything in Scrum, it's a living artifact. It's not something that you would do in the beginning and then never look at it again. I mean, when you use input from your product that you delivered, you can perhaps update your story map and your product backlog. So I would say usually your product owner takes the lead on this together perhaps with a Scrum Master or a business owner, but usually you want to have some representation of other disciplines as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, from my experience, the product owner doesn't even know something like this exists and doesn't think in that way. So you have to feed him this. So and I don't know what your experience is. If you work with product owners who see the benefit already, the benefit of using Scrum.
Right.
Do you feed them with, oh, we have to do this so you get insight in the features and the benefits?
It sounds to me like the product owner you're describing is a bit detached from the development team. Is that correct? So is he, for example, joining the sprint deliveries every sprint? Is he deciding whether or not one story needs to be put higher up in the chain or lower? Or does he listen to his team or perhaps the Scrum Master? It sounds to me like in this case, the product owner is too detached from the team. And if your team has trouble deciding what to do next, he can either go to the product owner and let him decide, but if he's not available or not there, yeah, what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to decide for yourself, but the outcome might not be something that the product owner wants, but at least if you use, for example, a story map, you can visualize, and when he comes around, you can say, well, look what we did here. This is probably going to be our next release. What do you think? You can also use the story map as a way to get the story or the product owner more involved in your project, because he might think it's too complicated or he has too much other tasks on his plate. Does it help? My answer? Okay. Right, so we looked at how you're going to build your story map from an existing, thank you, from an existing product backlog. But if you have an existing product with a lot of features already in play, can you still benefit from a story map? I think you can. If you have improvements across the board, so to say, I mean, a little bit over here, a little bit over there, it usually makes sense to just, at least write down these steps that your application is perhaps already doing. So you can identify at what areas you're going to improve. For example, the order status or your checkout feature. So those steps might be empty, but some of them might be filled. You don't necessarily have to do that. Fill them out because it's already implemented. But you can also say, when I build a new large feature on my existing project, let's build a small user story map for that. For example, let me see if this is my next slide. No. For example, when you develop the application, but there might be a back office system for your barista, that might be a whole separate story map if you want to. So you can still build that when you're venturing into a new big area of features for your new product. What's the time? Right. Larger projects. I'm really not a skilled Agile, experienced person. I don't really know a lot about the frameworks we have like SAFe or Nexus or the other fancy names they call them these days. But basically, in a skilled Agile environment, you might have a single product backlog where multiple teams are working out of that same product backlog, and they might deliver a single product. No matter what type of strategy you use, to divide the work, you want to isolate your teams a bit. You want to limit dependencies between teams. For example, if you're developing a new feature, but you have to wait for another feature to be delivered first, being done by another team, you have a dependency which is going to limit your speed of development. It's going to be an impediment. So usually we would say we have teams that are experienced in a particular feature. We call them feature teams. Or teams that are experienced and do a lot about specific components. For example, a team responsible for the database development or the backend application or only the UI. And in this example, I want to focus on the feature teams paradigm. So team A, team B, team C are all responsible for a certain feature set of your application. And I think you can see where I'm going with this, because you can just say, pick one slot, give that to a particular team, give the other slot, give that to another team, and you can limit your dependencies between teams, because it's basically a mini product backlog we have here for that particular team. But sometimes we have a bit of a larger product, we have multiple user story maps, or perhaps even, when I demonstrated with the hierarchy, the user activity on top that basically are multiple smaller user story maps, you can use that as your feed into your team, saying, okay, the whole mobile application, that's your department. The whole back office system, that's your department. And a user story map allows you to think about the isolation of features, so you can give those to your respective teams and let them work independently of each other. Quick recap, because I think we are almost done here. What's the time? 5 minutes. So a story map adds context to your product backlog. It adds an extra dimension, so to say. It allows you to visualize the steps that a user is going to take, or the steps that your application needs to support in relation to each other, which helps you to bring user perspective into release management. I know that Jeff Sutherland once said, nobody wants user login, bring in the dollars, which basically says, focus on the most key feature of your application first, and the user login is something we want to do later. But as we have seen, user login is something the user needs eventually. So at some point, you have to release something that makes sense to your user. So the user story map helps. And as we've seen, it is suitable for various projects. You can start from scratch, building a user story map, building your product backlog, and start feeding that work into your sprint teams. It also works for legacy projects or existing projects. We can build a user story map out of an existing backlog. Oh. And it's lightweight. I think you guys have enough understanding, if I'm successful today, to start today with sticky notes on the wall. I mean, whether you call it epic stories, user task, user subtags, whatever. You get the gist, right? You just have some steps and some richness in these steps. Now it's time for questions. Any questions so far or up until now? Wow, cool. Well, thanks all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I think we are right on time, actually. If you have any additional follow-ups, just, I'm wearing a t-shirt, so you can find me in the hallway or somewhere else. And I'm hoping you guys are able to benefit from the user story map in your project. Thank you.